Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Stephen Aaron. I'm the chair of the UCLA History Department, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this evening's panel, Los Angeles 2024 and the Lessons of Olympics Past. This evening's panel is part of the History Department's ongoing Why History Matters series, which was initiated 5 years ago by my predecessor, David Myers, who I believe I saw a moment ago, and I want him to actually stand up and be acknowledged for not simply for creating the Why History Matters series, but for surviving, thriving at times, and making our department so much stronger 5 years as chair of this department. His shoes are big ones to fill. David launched this series, and I think part of something that David and I have been working on for many years, in the belief that historical knowledge is an indispensable, if too often missing, ingredient in the wider public realm. I've often asserted, half-jokingly, that history is too important to be left to historians, by which I really mean that history is too important to be left to academics, or that history is too important to remain nearly exclusively an academic concern. We at UCLA, as faculty at a great public university, I think, have a special responsibility to make history matter more to more people. Accordingly, we launched, under David's leadership, a broad-reaching public history initiative. And I think this, the Why History Matters panels that we've done over the last 5 years are one arm of that initiative. One arm designed to bring historians from our department and elsewhere into conversations about matters of national and global significance. But with this evening's program, we seek to bring things even closer to home, and we also seek to make a much more direct impact on public policy. And for that turn in direction, we are particularly grateful to Meyer Luskin. A year and a half ago, Meyer delivered the commencement address at the History Department's graduation ceremony. His speech was entitled, "How History Saved My Ass," or I guess in the PG version, "How History Saved My Assets." In that talk, he reviewed the ways in which knowledge of history has informed crucial business decisions that he made in his lifetime, and literally saved his assets. He further outlined some examples in which lack of historical understanding and lack of historical knowledge had contributed to foolish decisions by those in power. More important, Meyer Luskin challenged the UCLA History Department to step away from our academic comfort zone and find ways to bring our research more directly to bear on public policy, to bring historically informed recommendations more directly into the public arena. We spent a good deal of last year thinking about how to meet that challenge and held a number of sessions in which we explored the intersections between history and policy and how we as historians could best influence policymakers and policy analysts. Vital in those efforts has been Zev Yaroslavsky, whom I'll introduce in a moment, and he has been particularly essential in what we decided would be our pilot project for this History and Policy initiative, this History and Policy program, which involves the decision by Los Angeles to go after the bid for the 2024 Olympic Games. To bring historical insight into the decisions facing city officials, we assembled a team under Yaroslavsky's leadership that included his longtime chief of staff, Elisa Katz, who's Acknowledge yourself, Elisa, thank you. As well as one of our most talented graduate students, Caitlin Parker, sitting right there, whose dissertation includes an examination of the impact of the 1984 Games on Los Angeles politics and society. Together, this team produced a research paper that we posted on our website, our department website. I invite all of you to read it, department website earlier this summer. And which basically that research paper detailed the history of the 1984 Games, paying particular attention to the decisions made by city officials and by the larger polity that accounted for the success of those games, certainly from a financial standpoint for the city. Zev also wrote a op-ed piece that I hope many of you have seen that appeared in the Los Angeles Times that I think really had an immediate impact on City Hall and on the decisions that were being taken about not only whether to bid for the games, but under what conditions to do so. And that remains an ongoing debate. But I think Zev's op-ed piece and the larger research paper proved to us that history really can make a difference, that history can matter. How much it ultimately matters to the bid that LA makes remains to be determined, as we will discuss this evening. In addition, however, to discussing what Los Angeles can learn from the 1984 experience, and more important to the key decisions leading up to the 1984 Games, what we can learn from that, we decided in putting together this evening's program, we decided that we as historians could also take a much deeper look at the Olympic history. Accordingly, I invited my colleague, David Phillips, sitting right here, to join the panel. Phillips is an associate professor in the history department whose books include Avengers of Blood, Homicide in Athenian Law and Custom from Draco to Demosthenes, and The Law of Ancient Athens. Now, in addition to being a scholar of ancient Greece, Phillips is a diehard fan of Cleveland sports teams, which I suppose uniquely qualifies him to weigh in on athletic contests that don't end well. But for the purposes of our conversation this evening, I've asked David to speak a little bit about some of the histories and mysteries that surround the ancient Greek Olympics and to help us think about how the myths of those games shaped and myth-shaped those of the modern era. Turning to that modern era, I thought it would be valuable not only to think about Los Angeles 1984 and the legacy it left, but also Los Angeles 1932. And I asked Peter Chesney, in part, to weigh in on that. He is also a PhD candidate, a native of Los Angeles, albeit, I think, too young to have lived through any of those previous Olympic Games in Los Angeles. His dissertation is entitled To Live and Drive in LA. He's the author, really, though, of a splendid paper that I hope will soon be published under the title Los Angeles 1984, Securing Capitalism's Liberal Future by Guaranteeing the Olympic Games. He's joined, as I mentioned, by Caitlin Parker, who was a member of our pilot project team and is completing a dissertation on urban policy and racial inequality during the 20-year mayoralty of Tom Bradley, which, like Chesney's, includes an examination of the 1984 Olympics. Parker is currently a lecturer at CSU Long Beach, where she teaches courses on 20th century U.S. history, urban history, and historical methods. For another perspective on LA 84 and LA 2024, we're honored to have, at the far end, Barry Sanders. Sanders is the chairman of the Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games. He also recently retired as a partner from the law firm of Latham & Watkins. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, a recipient of the Learned Hand Award for Outstanding Leadership in the Legal Profession, and currently, most important of all, I think, an adjunct professor in the Communication Studies Department at UCLA. The Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games, which he chairs, has long been engaged in promoting the Olympic movement and seeking to bring the Olympics back to Los Angeles. He's also the author of the Los Angeles 1984 Olympic Games, which we have on for sale outside, and I highly recommend the book for those of you who want to, in some of your cases, I'm looking out at the age of the crowd, remember your youth in the 1984 Olympics. And finally, last but not least, we have Zev Yaroslavsky, who I think needs no introduction to this crowd. Now, I could go through his resume, the various political offices he's held, the policies he's championed, the initiatives he's engineered, and so forth. But let's cut right to the most important part of it, of his CV. He holds a BA in economics and history from UCLA and an MA in British imperial history, which I'm not sure how this comes to bear on his subsequent career exactly, but an MA in British imperial history,
Vocational training.
also from UCLA. He now has a split appointment between the Luskin School for Public Policy and the Department of History at UCLA, where he is the director of the Los Angeles Initiative. And as I've mentioned, he has spearheaded, and we are very grateful to him for this, our History and Policy project, including leading the team, as I said, that has brought much needed history to the LA 2024 debate. With that, I'm going to move over here and join my fellow panelists to moderate the discussion. But I wanted to start by asking Dave Phillips to provide a little bit of the Greek perspective, or the ancient Greek perspective. And I guess I could start by asking, if there was a Cleveland in ancient Greece, what would that be? Or, other than their attire or lack thereof in the ancient Olympics, what can we learn from the ancient Olympics?
The Cleveland of ancient Greece, to start with the more important and more germane question first, was undoubtedly Athens, as it was the center of Western civilization, just as Cleveland is for the modern world. Now, to move on to the somewhat less related question of the ancient Greek Olympic Games, what were they, what can we learn from them? Well, first, what were they? While the ancient Greek Olympic Games are, of course, the inspiration for the modern Olympics, they were a very different kind of creature. Fundamentally, they were a religious festival in honor of Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. And the great festival with the games was held, according to tradition, every 4 years at Olympia in the Western Peloponnese. So only in one place. There were no such things as bids for the ancient Olympic Games. They always took place in the same place. Every 4 years, according to tradition, from 776 BC down to AD 393, when they came to an end. They were not an international competition in our sense. They were an international competition in the ancient Greek sense, which is to say that, assuming that you were athletically qualified, any Greek man or later boy could participate, was eligible to participate. So it's a very different kind of creature. It's international, but they're all Greek and only Greek. They're only male. Originally men's competitions, later boys' competitions are added for boys in their late teens. In terms of things that tend to get brought up with regard to the ancient games in the context of the modern games, there are two especially important myths that need to be dispelled. The first has to do with amateurism, and the second has to do with the Olympic truce. With regard to amateurism, we used to hear, we don't hear it so much anymore, now that professional athletes have entered the modern games. We used to hear, oh, what a shame it is, this scourge of professionalism in the ancient Greek world, they never did this. Well, that's just not true. In the very beginning, when the Olympics were a purely local festival, yes, probably these were amateurs, but by the time we really know anything about the history of the Olympic Games, these are professional athletes. They are elite, wealthy Greek males who, first of all, have the leisure time to spend their whole year training for various athletic competitions, not just the Olympics. And the myth of amateurism comes from the fact that at Olympia itself, after you won an event, all you got was a crown of olive leaves. And that was only for the winner. There's one winner, everybody else is a loser.
No bronze, silver.
No silver, no bronze. That's all you get on the spot. But when you get home, it was common for victors in the ancient Greek Olympics to receive things like free food for the rest of their lives, cash prizes. These are not amateurs. So amateurism, that's a myth. The Olympic truce. We occasionally hear about the noble ancient Greek Olympic truce, and the fact of the matter is that this was not something that put an end to all wars in the Greek world everywhere for the duration of the games. That's the myth. The fact is the Greeks were much more practical about this. They realized they couldn't put an end to all wars in their world for the duration of the Olympic Games. The actual Olympic truce just covers the games themselves and travel to and from the games, and that's it. Other than that, we know, unfortunately, then as now, wars went on during the Olympic Games. So that's the ancient Olympics in a nutshell.
So we'll come back to see what lessons we take away, besides what will be on David's final exam, that Cleveland is the Athens of the, or Athens is the Cleveland
Center of
the
Western civilization.
The center of
Either
Western civilization.
one is fine.
I believe there's only one ancient Greek history course which features that, that interpretation.
There is none.
Peter, I guess to sort of move forward to the modern era and maybe think a little bit about 32 and 84 and the legacies they left for the city. And you know, as the author of a dissertation, working on a dissertation to live and drive in LA, certainly one of the things people remember about the 1984 games is how easy it was to drive during them. But I wonder, what sort of short and long-term legacies would you point to in thinking about 32 and 84 that you'd want to sort of make sure is part of a conversation?
Absolutely. Okay, so just to give a sense of a few different legacies, first of all, that come from 32, I think it's important to keep in mind that 32 was such an early event in the history of the modern Olympics. It was only the 10th Olympiad, so it came at a time when people weren't that sure whether the Olympics were going to be around for that long. And like 84, 32 was a really key moment in securing the future of the Games. 32 was actually the first profitable Olympics, and 1984 was actually the second profitable Olympics. So this is a distinction that Los Angeles can claim. But more importantly, for 1932 and kind of paving the way for the future of the Olympics internationally and for Los Angeles in particular, 1932 I think was very influential in establishing the civic identity of Los Angeles. First of all, in terms of the question of urban form, prior to 1932, a key Los Angeles landmark, actually I'm going to say 25,001 of them did not yet exist. First of all, those palm trees that are so identifiable in Los Angeles, 25,000 of them were planted in anticipation of the 1932 Olympic Games. And the reason why they did that was back in the 1920s and the 1930s, urban planners believed that when people drove or traveled by roads, there should be something pretty for them to look at while they were doing so. So they wanted to build these really wide, beautiful parks along these roads, hence the term parkway on the East Coast. They wanted to bring those to Los Angeles. But because of property interests, nobody really wanted to give up all that street frontage. So in anticipation of the 32 games, they decided that a thin row of palm trees would suffice. And we're still living with that legacy today, although not for much longer, unfortunately. Palm trees actually only live for about 90 to 100 years. So all those palm trees are about to die. So I thought I might point that out. The other legacy, of course, of the 32 games is the Coliseum. And the import of the Coliseum is actually much greater, I think, than a lot of people acknowledge. The Coliseum is not just where some other university in Los Angeles hosts its football games. The Coliseum it really was the largest sports stadium in the world in 1932, 100,000 seats. And when Los Angeles built this stadium, nobody really knew what they were going to be doing with this enormous stadium because there was no market for for so many spectators in LA. So it actually created this glut of seats that led to a whole bunch of sporting entrepreneurs to try to figure out a way to fill those seats. And so in a sense, you could argue, and this is what John Anson Ford argues in about the legacy of his his time when he was not only a county sup, but he was also in charge of the Coliseum. Ford argues that because of the presence of the Coliseum, it actually created an incentive to create mass spectator sports. And the LA Rams was the first brand really to take advantage of this opportunity. And in many ways, today's NFL is a legacy of the presence of this enormous monument in Los Angeles. As far as '84 is concerned, my research is on driving and is on traffic. And the beauty of 1984 was that it's true, there really wasn't very much traffic during 1984. And the primary reason for that, again, not to be too discouraging, the primary reason for that is that the LAOC innovated all these new ways of diverting traffic. They banned truck traffic during the day. They set up all these one-way streets. They staggered traffic lights at intersections. And what urban planners argue about those kinds of solutions is that once drivers have enough time to adjust, the traffic tends to come back. So the reason the traffic was so light, in all likelihood, partially was a result of the fact that there were all these new innovations and people kind of stayed off the roads initially and didn't really know yet how to adjust to them such that they would, clog up the roadways.
So I'm going to come back to something that you've talked about in terms of alternative. There was a sort of, going back to David's point about the professionalism and the amateurism, that there was a sort of semi-professional alternative Olympics that we've now largely forgotten that was sort of going on in the early years of the 20th century, and including sort of competing with the LA Olympics.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, I would even
Sort
go
of
so
open to working class people who couldn't afford necessarily to.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sort of the
In
ideal of
1936 in Barcelona, there was actually an alternative Olympic Games that was held for working people, because the ideal of amateurism, not as a true historical legacy, but as something that was revived in imitation of something that never existed in the first place. That ideal of amateurism actually made it so that working people couldn't participate in the Olympic Games. So the Olympics held in 1936 in Berlin was actually much smaller than the Barcelona Olympics that were planned for 1936 until Franco began his rebellion the night before the opening ceremony, so they canceled it.
So Caitlin, I want you to talk a little bit about 1984 and your perspective on what it did for the city, or maybe also what it didn't do.
Sure. Well, the 1984 Olympics are really seen as the high point of the Bradley administration. And Bradley himself pointed to the private sponsorship of the Olympics as what was so key to its success. And that really became, the Olympics really became a model for him of how to create public-private partnerships, including the response to 92 Rodney King with Rebuild LA. But what was so unique about 1984 was that the LAOC was the first privatized Olympics. It turned a $235 million profit. And Peter Ueberroth, who led the efforts, really pioneered the kind of modern day exclusive sponsorship and licensing partnerships. And so he, for example, negotiated with ABC to get a $225 million contract, which was more than any previous winter Summer Olympics combined. And then held bidding wars between major corporations to be the exclusive sponsor for the Olympic film or the Olympic soft drink. And that allowed the '84 Olympics to be really profitable, and the second profitable Olympics in the 20th century. So that when Zev and Elisa and I looked at the sort of what was similar and what was different from the 1984 context, I think one difference was that the city was able to have a private entity guarantee the games, control the fundraising, and Ueberroth's model was so successful that the IOC later adopted it as what's called the Olympic program, which was now the international model of sponsorship. So the idea that Los Angeles could so closely control the fundraising mechanism, that's no longer a possibility. the question of whether you could have a private guarantor for the Olympics rather than the taxpayers, which is what Zev worked on precluding. That question, I guess, is still in the air. At the KPCC talk, Anita DeFrance kind of seemed to indicate that that wouldn't be a deal breaker, having a private guarantor for the games. Other people have seemed to say that that would tank a bid compared to another European bid.
So before I bring our British Imperial historian and our chairman of the Southern California Olympic Committee into this conversation, both of whom have powerful and persuasive views, I guess I want to take a little straw poll. How many people in this audience were here in LA in 1984, first of all? Wow.
Wow.
Wow. Okay. Now, I guess we're not going to exclude the others here, but I just am curious, how many of you would like to see the 2024 Olympics in Los Angeles? Very strong vote. How many of you would like to see the 2024 Olympics in Los Angeles absent the kind of financial guarantee that the 1984 games were able to sort of negotiate, meaning that the city taxpayers would not be on the hook for whatever cost overruns might be in the budget? Absent that guarantee. So if sort of, as we're going to hear in a moment.
Absent the absence of the guarantee.
Why don't you just say how many people think that you should want, how many of you want the Olympics if the city had to pay for them?
If there was okay. So I guess just with that to sort of set it up, obviously there's, very few hands went up on the second part. So I guess, Barry, I want to start with you because I think you have a pretty powerful view about, why it would be a very good thing for Los Angeles to have the Olympics in 2024 and why we should aggressively pursue that bid.
Mm-hmm.
Based on, in part, 1984 and other.
Okay, well, as a matter of full disclosure, and first of all, in talking about the history of the games, we have in the room Rich Perlman, a great Bruin, who knows more about the history of the '84 games than I'll ever know. And this book was I only had confidence it was accurate after he'd read it and said so. But with that apology to you that you're taking second best, I was deeply involved with the '84 games because I negotiated with Peter those contracts which you speak, and then followed Olympic things thereafter consistently. The current bid that the mayor's office put forward to the U.S. Olympic Committee in order to try to become the U.S. city is one that was developed by my Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games, and then taken by the mayor's office with some amendments, and up to the point where they chose Boston. It remains now as amended by the mayor's office as the bid we are pursuing for the moment. Now, I'm on the bid committee, so that's another disclosure. I'm prejudiced in this. That proposal is subject to constant amendment. So when you say have the games here, well, have which games here? The games as presently described in what we're proposing, I think would be a great thing for Los Angeles, as were the games of '84 and '32. And they weren't just the first games that made a profit. They remain the only games that made a profit. Or as we call it, a surplus, because it's a nonprofit corporation. The proposals do become somewhat moving targets. As of now, Tokyo, who has the games for 2020, does not have a stadium proposal. Because the stadium proposal they put forward 3 years ago when they were awarded the games, they found to be too expensive. So they've abandoned it and they're redesigning it. 2 weeks ago, Tokyo took the heads of the Cycling Federation 2.5 hours outside Tokyo to show them an existing velodrome so they could save the $100 million they had proposed in their bid for a velodrome. So the costs projected and so on are subject to cost control through planning and constant amendment. But if we take the proposal we're looking at now, and we have in it the makings of a terrific success in every way, including financially. This is an event to occur 9 years from now. Only a fool is going to predict economic results 9 years from now. But the makings are there, if properly managed. And we have to assume they'll be properly managed as they were beautifully managed by, actually, predominantly by Harry Usher, working with Peter Ueberroth in the '84 games. The real reason we had a surplus, or at least take back real, the predominant reason was not the increase in revenue, which I guarantee you for 2024 is already increased over '84, but it was the reduction in cost. The team bidding for the games for 1984, and there had been no competition, so we weren't even in this process we're in now, really, realized that all the Olympic Games that failed to make a surplus in the past had actually at least broken even as operating entities. Their failure to make a surplus is when you added their infrastructure cost, when you added the buildings of buildings. Now, this isn't to say the other cities were incompetent. If you don't have a Coliseum, as Tokyo doesn't, you have to build one. If you don't have a velodrome even 2.5 hours away, you have to build one. But if you have all this stuff, you don't have to build it, and that means you're only looking at your operating cost, and even for the most poorly managed of Olympic Games in the past, they managed to break even there. Vancouver, with all their bumbling about the village, decided at the end they'd broken even. Now, because they break even though they were all required to give a guarantee, a governmental guarantee to the IOC, that guarantee never had to be honored because it was a guarantee that that operating budget would not run into deficit. Now, even today, though, knowing the history of cities having given this guarantee, knowing that a guarantee of some kind is required in the Olympic Charter, it's not clear what kind of guarantee will be expected of us. You may have noticed that when all but one wonderful man failed to put arms up saying we'd support this at taxpayer expense, I also didn't put my arms up. I would not support this at taxpayer expense. Though I might add that the other cities that have gone and done it generally don't regret it. But I wouldn't support it. But I don't see this requiring taxpayer expense. You have to, if you're looking at guarantees, and any man or woman here who knows how to read a document and do business knows you better read the words. I've read the host city agreement that's been supplied to us for 2024. The draft was supplied to us September 16th, the day after we had to put our hat in the ring. And I've looked at the charter section. It's not at all clear from either of those documents that the city would be responsible to pick up any deficit. You have to read the words carefully, and to some degree you have to work on those words between now and a year from now, when the city would be expected to sign that agreement, so that the meaning of it is clear. We should take no wooden nickels. We should make sure that the taxpayer is protected, but we can. We can because we can make sure those words are ones that don't get us in trouble, and fundamentally we can because the proposal we have on the table, and any one we would get to, that might include proposals that would greatly reduce the cost of the current village idea, are proposals that we could keep under control in terms of their costs as we go forward, as Tokyo's beginning to do. So if you begin to build buildings and you've broken ground, you're stuck with that cost. But this proposal for 2024 imagines the building of one small permanent building, a shooting venue in Sepulveda Basin. For '84, we had to build 3. We're down to 1. And that's not even because we used the '84 venues. 3/4 of the venues that are proposed in this bid are new since '84. And even one that we might say we used before, like Pauley Pavilion, was rebuilt down to the struts. So we've got what we need. We can do this, and we should.
But one of the things that Zev certainly has brought up with his more skeptical view, not, I mean, I think sort of saying we certainly should learn from the successes of Los Angeles '84, but be wary of, if we don't get the same guarantees, of the potential follies. And one of the things that you've certainly highlighted in terms of what infrastructure that may not be there yet is the Olympic Village and the potential costs, unless we are maybe again planning on having the Olympians housed in one-room triples up on the hill here, which I'm not sure sort of meet the current standards of it. But I guess I want to bring Zev in terms of sort of your perspective on both sort of what's worth emulating, but where your fears are in terms of the road that LA may be wandering down if the lessons of history aren't abided by?
Well, first, let me thank you all for coming, and thank you, Steve, for putting this together. Secondly, I want to say that I ran track at Fairfax High School. Actually, I walked track at Fairfax High School. And I like to say that I'm probably the only politician or ex-politician you will ever meet, except for Jim Ryan, who subscribed to Track and Field News for a number of years. So I am a big Olympic fan. I'm a big track and field fan and several other sports. So nothing would make me happier than to be able to go to another games, and I'm not going to go overseas to see another game, so it's either here or it's nowhere. I'm of the opinion, as I was in 1978 when the negotiations the critical negotiations took place over the 84 games, that we should have the games, but we should not spend a nickel of taxpayers' money to have them. Peter Ueberroth, in his book, Made in America, writes, and I quote, well, first of all, he said that he had voted for the charter amendment that we wrote and put on the ballot that prevented the city from spending money on the games. And secondly, he said that the city has a lot more important things to do with its money other than to spend them on a sporting event, even a sporting event as important as the Olympic Games. And I think we ought to keep that in mind. The question is, how much of a risk do you all want to take? This is your money. It's my pension, but it's your money. And that's the issue. This is a different time than 1978, but there are a lot of similarities. The similarities are, or could be, in 1978, the city made the decision that they were prepared to walk away from the bid, even though it was the only bidder. It wasn't exactly the only bidder. There was another city, that it was Tehran, which was undergoing a revolution at the time, so Barry was correct in saying we were the only bidder. But even though we were the only bidder, we were prepared to walk away from the games. The city council at that time, and I was on the council and I was in the middle of this discussion, insisted that we put a charter amendment on the ballot, the city's governing document, that prevented the city from going financially haywire or hog wild over the games. The mayor did not want to do it. Mayor Bradley did not want to do it. But there was a majority of the council that was prepared to put it on the ballot, and he saw the writing on the wall, and he led the parade. So much so that at one time, in the spring, late spring of 1978, he actually sent a letter to the city council asking them, this is after the president of the International Olympic Committee, Lord Callanan, was playing hardball, he sent a letter to the city council asking the city council to withdraw its bid, because it was the city council that made the bid. Now, that was a tactic, and it worked. The next day, Callanan was on the phone saying, let's talk. And that letter was referred to committee, where it sat for months until the negotiations were satisfactorily resolved. The negotiations were resolved when the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, gave the city of Los Angeles a hold harmless, that they were not going to be held financially responsible for the games. Plus the charter amendment, which ensured that, created the situation where once Ueberroth came into the picture, and he didn't come into the picture until 1979, it had to be run in balance because there was no deep pocket that was going to make up the difference, as there could be now and as there has been with other cities. So here's the deal. How willing is this city council and the mayor prepared to play this out and say we will walk away from the games if we aren't satisfied that we are protected? Because if they are prepared to walk away, then they have a reasonable negotiating opportunity, and it doesn't have to be a contentious one. It can be, we can get into that later, it can be a constructive engagement with the IOC, as Anita DeFrance kind of hinted at in the forum we had a few weeks ago. But if the city is not willing to walk away from the games, if it's the Olympics uber alles, then Katie bar the door, because they will give away the store. They will have to give away the store, because they're going to get whipsawed by Paris and Hamburg if they stay in the hunt, Rome, and Budapest, which is also in the hunt. There are other cities that chose not, Toronto chose not to bid on the games. Other cities chose not to bid on the games. In the Winter Games, Oslo, Norway, which once hosted the games, I think the Winter Games, chose not to host the games.
They did once, yes.
The Olympics have become the province of centralized governments who have a political reason to spend billions on an event to showcase their country or their regime. That's why the Olympics are going to Beijing. The Winter Games in 2022 are going to Beijing. And the two bidders were Beijing and Almaty, Kazakhstan. That's what the Olympics could easily become if somehow the IOC does not get religion and work with cities like LA, if they wanted to come to LA or any other American city. Boston pulled out because they were afraid of this. So one last comment and I will, and I'll shut up.
No.
There are a number of capital projects that we're going to have to do here. One of them is the shooting gallery. One of them is a velodrome. One of them is by the Olympic Committee, the local bid committee's own budget, an $800 million improvement or refurbishment of the Coliseum. What they say is a $1 billion Olympic Village, and there's no developer I've spoken to who thinks you can build 7,000 units in the city of Los Angeles for $1 billion. It's triple that. And if you build it in a place with a toxic waste problem, as the Union Pacific Railroad yards near the LA River, the cleanup alone could be as high as $1 billion. There's the matter of the broadcast center, which the local committee has said is going to be paid for by Universal Studios. I've talked to my friends at Universal Studios. They say they're not paying for it. They don't know who's paying for it, but they're not paying for it. USC was going to pay, according to the budget that the local committee put out, was going to pay $500 million for the refurbishment of the Coliseum. They just announced that they are going to spend $270 million fixing the Coliseum up for Trojan football. It's possible they could come up with another $230 million. Knowing SC as I do, it won't be an easy negotiation. So there are big gaps, a $2 or $3 billion gap in the Olympic Village, several $100 million gap in both the broadcast center and the Coliseum. The city will be on the hook, either legally with the IOC or to its own taxpayers, because they're not going to leave a half-built Olympic Village or a half-built broadcast center. They're going to have to finish it off unless they are motivated through discipline, and I would prefer through some legislation, disciplined not to overspend.
So
Barry said that this is, and he's right, and this is not a geometry problem. This is an arithmetic problem. You've got to maximize your revenues and minimize your expenditures, as Uberoth did, and it can work.
So I want to bring one more ingredient into the mix here in terms of both the parallels with 84, 32, ancient Greece, but obviously things that suggest that history isn't just repeating itself. That is to say, important changes. Obviously, security has long been a concern for the Olympics, and I don't know what the story was in ancient Greece in terms of what they spent on providing security to the athletes and the
Security was a concern.
Okay, we'll come back to that in 1 second, because I do want to sort of express, especially in light of the events last Friday, which may damage Paris's bid, as you pointed out to me in the green room before, in terms of its, whether it would want to pursue the Olympics and just the costs there. But it does raise the question, obviously since '72, in the modern era, people have been very concerned with terrorism, but presumably the security costs, most of which might be paid by the federal government, but still, certainly challenge any host city in terms of especially the kind of atmosphere that the Olympics is carried out under. I do want to hear a little bit about sort of what kind of security concerns existed in the deeper past and in the more recent past, but then I also would like to invite Zev and Barry to speak about sort of, what they see in the way in which terrorism maybe changes the equation a little bit now.
Okay, security concerns in antiquity. So it was traditional that the Olympic truce, one of the elements of the ancient Olympic truce, was that you could not bear arms within the area where the games were held. And the first evidence we have of violation of that led to a change in the rule, probably in the year 668 BC. The ruler of the city of Argos in the northeastern Peloponnese, a man named Phaedon, interfered with the conduct of the Olympic Games by force of arms. He got rid of the presiding magistrates, he presided himself. And this clearly was a security issue. The then governing body from the city-state of Elis, which is up the road from ancient Olympia, decided not to count those Olympics. And thenceforth, the presiding officials went around armed, while everybody else was not permitted to carry weapons. So, yes, and even the Olympic truce, that was the first and apparently the most famous or infamous example of the violation of the truce, but there were others as well.
So I'll say about 32 that security was so little an issue at 1932 that Tom Bradley, as a teenage black adolescent, was able to sneak through and jump over a gate to get into a number of events. That's at least according to some possibly apocryphal memories that he shared during the '84 era of his personal history with the games. But in '84, the situation had changed dramatically, largely because of Munich, and how in the planning for '84, keep in mind that the planning was happening in the late '70s, so Munich was fresh on everybody's mind. So on the one hand, you needed to protect athletes because the international situation had changed. But on the other hand, there was this added political element that made security really important, and that was that the Soviet Union refused to send their team to participate in this event if their team was not protected from right-wing white agitators in Southern California. Now, the degree to which this was, pretty much a joke, it was an excuse, it was a response to the boycott in 1980. There are a lot of things you can say, but that's the way in which securitization rhetoric was appropriated in the context of the '84 Games. It was actually used as the official excuse for Soviet non-participation.
Can you talk a little about security and policing in Los Angeles?
Yeah, sure. So I think there were kind of two strands. I mean, there was on the one hand the fear of international terrorism, but then there was also the fear, the Olympics are an event to project the kind of best side of a city. It was to put Los Angeles on the map as a global city. And kind of three of the main concerns that people thought were part of the stereotype or growing stereotype of Los Angeles were traffic, smog, and gangs. And so part of the lead up to the '84 Olympics, and I think a part that's less well remembered, but certainly was strong in some communities, was the kind of policing leading up to the Olympics to make Los Angeles present a certain image to international visitors. So what that meant was that there were a lot of gang sweeps that happened, particularly in the neighborhoods around the Coliseum, also around downtown. And then there were a number of lawsuits that occurred, one of which a security concern was wanting to be able to check the criminal background of anyone who applied to work in the Olympic villages. And the concern was that it would not just be convictions, it would be any kind of minor record, which would screen out a lot of people who would be trying to get employment there. So that was a suit that the ACLU pursued and won. Another concern was that because of the security around the venues, there was a big effort to have a minority business program, but they were not allowed inside the venues, they were on the outside. So while a lot of the major corporate sponsors definitely profited from the Olympics, and I think maybe that's another myth, this idea that there's no profit in the Olympics. While they profited, a lot of the minority business, small businesses went bankrupt during that time. And so there was a sense of a sort of dichotomy of who the Olympics was for in the city that I think gets lost in the also very legitimate remembrance of what a joyous time it was for the city and how it brought so many people together.
Barry, you want to come in on the?
No, Zev, why don't you
Zev?
go first?
Go ahead.
Well, as to the victim analysis that you've just heard, it's important, especially here at the university, to not accept the orthodox narrative on things. But the victim analysis has become its own orthodoxy. With apologies to Theseus, it's sort of the Procrustean bed on which all academic analysis is now stretched. It's the idea that those corporations profited and these other poor guys, these minorities, were chosen to not profit and were somehow victimized is nonsense. The concessions that were outside the venues were inside the perimeter by contract with the LAOC, inside the protected perimeter. There was an area outside the Coliseum that was the gathering place, and that's where people who contracted to offer merchandise were allowed to put up their booths and did put up their booths. Some of them over-ordered based on their own projections of how much they could sell. But they were within the perimeter of the Olympics, and outside that perimeter, people were not allowed to use the Olympic rings. These were a dozen contractors who were allowed to use the rings to make merchandise, whether it was jackets or it was seat cushions or whatever. And some of them did not make a profit, others did. A dozen of them brought arbitrations later saying they'd been defrauded into thinking they could sell more than they sold, and they lost every single one of those arbitrations. It's just not applicable. It's certainly when Beijing put on the Olympics and bulldozed Hutongs, the neighborhoods all around the venues, there were no end of victims. You could say that the taxpayers were victims in all the places where the taxpayers had to foot the bill. But in this case, the facts are a little too stubborn for it. I'm sure they're unhappy people. The world is full of lots of victims, too many, and therefore too many victimizers. But this just is not what the games were about here. This was an episode in Los Angeles history of virtually, you have to say virtually because who knows who's out there, but virtually unanimous joy. It reflects itself in the hands that went up earlier this evening. And it's a memory of days that did, as you say, have not only no traffic, no smog, but no crime. The results of the event, and Zev has even commented to me that the biggest reason why crime stopped is it stopped actually during the playing of the events because the prospective criminals were actually watching. The games were put together with 33,000 volunteers, typically middle-class people, but about 40,000 employees. And they were in service business, and typically working people were the ones who got paid as opposed to not paid. When the games were over, there was that $235 million surplus, $100 million of which went to set up the Amateur Athletic Foundation, now called the LA84 Foundation. And in the years since then, we've spent over $200 million on kids' sports in Southern California, predominantly inner-city sports, so that the Williams sisters from Compton learned to play tennis on the Department of Recreation and Parks city courts with lessons sponsored by the LA84 Foundation. This is not a case of victimization.
Zeb, do you want to come in also on the costs associated also with the security costs and what that does in terms of, because one of the things that Barry's written that I think is really powerful about Olympics, it takes beyond the ledger sheet in terms of supporting Olympics, is that, he's written about the 84 games, that the 84 games where the Olympics or the successful holding of the Olympics is the ultimate validation of a city, and that LA during the 84 Olympics achieved a change in its perception by others and by itself. Angelinos, and I think many in this room, remember the 16 days as the most exciting of their lives. The city gained a new confidence and a new reputation as a major world metropolis and a cultural capital. Those are Barry's words. I think they're a powerful statement on behalf of the Olympics, but does that same situation still obtain, not only on, if the security concerns are ratcheted up to such a degree that the kind of atmosphere is so terrifying in the face of the threat of terror?
Well, in the 1984 games, security was a major issue for the 1984 games, because in the run-up to the games, starting in 77, 78 with the bid and then the organization of the games, it was just a few years after Munich. Munich was very much a part of the consciousness of the people who were organizing the games. So the kind of security that took place here at the Village, here at UCLA and at SC and all the venues, it was well done, but it was very secure. And there was, I'm sure, a commitment and an objective by Ubroth and everybody down the chain that we were not going to have anything close to a repeat of Munich. And in fact, it was largely incident-free games, at least major incident. Part of that is preparation. Part of that is luck. There used to be a sign on my high school gym that said, luck is where preparation meets opportunity. In this case, opportunity didn't descend on us. The incident in Paris the other night, you know, there are some who believe this is that the odds of Paris getting the games diminish somewhat because of that. Let me tell you something. We have 9 years to go. There will be, the odds are that there will be terrorism visited upon a lot of cities. And hopefully, I'm wrong about that, but nobody is immune from it, including our own. So security is going to be a major issue. Now, the argument is that the 24 committee is putting forward is that the federal government's going to take care of all the security costs. That's not true. They say that they take care of all the security costs for a political convention. They take care of the security costs for the Super Bowl. That's not true. They may take care of the intelligence costs. There may be some federal involvement in security. There will be some federal involvement in security, and it's expensive. And the feds will take care of that, but they won't take care of all the security costs. The people, the law enforcement officers who are going to police the venues are not going to be Secret Service agents or FBI agents. They're going to be too busy doing other things. It's going to be the LAPD and the sheriff and the highway patrol. Who's going to pay for them? In the LA24 bid committee's budget, not one penny for security. Not one penny. It's true.
That's not
Well, it may
effective.
not be true at the end, but that's the budget that's put forward. And so we need to be concerned about that. I do want to say one other thing about this whole undertaking. You referred to me as a skeptic. I think that's a fair statement. There need to be more skeptics in this town. There need to be more skeptics in City Hall. There need to be more skeptics on the City Council. When I was on the City Council in '78, the majority were skeptics. That doesn't mean they were anti-Olympics. The majority of them voted to have the Olympics, but only after they were satisfied that there were sufficient protections that we had. There is none of that conversation, or let me put it differently, a minimum of that conversation taking place now. And that's got to be ratcheted up.
Okay, let me respond to some of this.
I wasn't attacking you.
Yeah, no, not me, and the budget is not one I created. But
That's
I'm
correct.
aware of it. In the budget that the mayor's office created, there is a city operations line item of $200 million. In the '84 games, we paid $20 million to the city for the city services. There's a 2.5, based on inflation, there's almost a little less than 2.5 multipliers, so that's almost $50 million. Here there's a $200 million line item. The vast preponderance of city services was then and would be now policing. So I read and agreed totally with Zev and Caitlin's white paper. And I agree totally with Zev in saying we need to be skeptical and we shouldn't take a wooden nickel. But in fairness, there is a $200 million line item for city operations to be primarily security. Furthermore, as to buildings, the proposal that the mayor has now has the use of the current velodrome, one of the only 2 indoor velodromes in the country. Maybe over time they'll have to change, but that's the current proposal, not to build a new one. As to the media center, Universal tells me they do plan to build it, just as the mayor's been saying. And you may hear differently, but that's what they tell me, and that's what the mayor's proposal says. As to Caitlin's comment in passing, which is certainly accurate, that in '84 we, the organizing committee, did the negotiation for licensing, sponsorships, and TV, and brought in total, on all of those, $400 million, which was radically more than anybody had raised before. However, the IOC saw the money in them their hills, took it over after that, and have greatly exceeded inflation costs. So what they are guaranteeing to us now in their host city agreement is to write us a check for $1.7 billion. The mayor's proposal, which showed a $200 million surplus, assumed it was going to be $1.5 billion. It's $1.7 billion. Now, that doesn't include domestic sponsorships. So the $400 million that we got is currently worth about $950 million in 2015 dollars. That's what we got from all sponsorships, all licensing, all TV. The IOC is going to give us $1.7 billion and still leave us with over $1.3 billion we could raise from local and national sponsorships. That's not only is that multiples of the revenue we had from those sources, but that $1.7 billion they're guaranteeing to us. They've already got their NBC deal through 2032, so they know they've got the money. We not only are getting more money, but we have complete certainty on the money. What's adjustable is the costs. And as to the possibility of triplexes up the hill, in our bid that the Southern California Committee put forward that then the mayor took over, we had 3 possible villages, not 1. And the first of them was UCLA residence halls, and a beautiful letter from Chancellor Block offering them to us, knowing that in 2024, we'll be able to seat bed the 17,000 athletes without triplexes. The capacity at UCLA will be able to handle it on one campus. Incidentally, USC is sitting telling us they could do it too.
So I'd like to just respond the following way. If this is such a good deal, and if it's such a sure thing, then why isn't there anyone in the private sector who would step up and say, we'll guarantee it? Why would the powers that be not be willing to replicate a charter amendment as was put on the ballot in 1978 and say, this is such a good deal, we are comfortable that we can say no taxpayer dollars will be spent on these games? Nobody's come forward with that, and nobody wants to put that charter amendment on the ballot. So I love Barry, and he's been a great resource to me on understanding the Olympic Games. I've been around the track with public officials, probably as much as you have.
I would say more.
But I've been on the inside, and I sincerely hope that some of the public officials will begin to speak and act in the interest of fiscal responsibility. We would not have had a Peter Uberoth but for the position that the city took in 1978, saying no tax dollars. Necessity is the motherhood of invention. So no city money, there had to be created a private committee. If it hadn't have been for that, the city would have run the games with a committee, and it would have been run out of City Hall. It would have been a disaster. That was the plan. So I really hope you're right. But in the words of the man after whom the medical center is named once said, trust but verify. And I don't want the taxpayers to put their full faith and credit behind these games. Here's what the charter says, and I think it's pretty close to accurate, that the city shall be responsible for the staging and the operation of the games. Mm-hmm. And that's the guarantee, that's essentially the guarantee that they're going to be asked to sign. And to me, that means responsible. That includes financially responsible. It also says, the charter of the IOC, that it doesn't have to be the city. It could be the city, it can be the state or the province, it could be the national government, or any other third party. In 1984, the third party, I believe, was the United States Organizing Committee.
Olympic Committee.
Olympic Committee. In Atlanta, it was a joint powers authority because Atlanta was precluded by Georgia's state constitution from spending money on the games, local taxpayer money. They created a joint powers authority that guaranteed the games. And I'm hoping that the city of LA and the LA 24 committee in the next 11 or 12 months will engage the IOC. It's not likely that it'll work, but engage the IOC over this kind of a conversation. Here's the problem. The city council, after our white paper came out, I'm not going to say that the white paper
No, we
made
want to
the
say
difference.
that.
You can say that.
No, we'll say that. Say
But,
it.
but I think it had something to do with it. The city council bought some time. They refused to commit to signing the guarantee in August when they had this matter before them. But they deferred that decision essentially till the end of 2016, by which time they're going to have to fish or cut bait, at least on today's facts. I'm not sure anybody's going to know a whole lot more in November of 2016 than it knows now.
So, okay, so we're gonna continue this conversation, by the way, out there. We have some food and drink for everyone to partake in. We'll continue the conversation with the people. You're free to mingle and talk. I do want to, though, with keeping in mind that you are what stands between people and the food and drink, give people a chance for one final comment about what one lesson or lessons they would want if the mayor were sitting there or others responsible for the bid were sitting there, what one lesson from Olympics past they would maybe want the mayor to hear?
Very well.
Wear clothing?
Right. Well, I mean, there are all kinds of things that happen in the ancient Olympics that we don't want in the modern Olympics, such as rampant nudity. We don't want that. The
Speak for
exclusion
yourself.
of, except for Zev, we don't want that. The exclusion of women, we don't want that. A limitation to Greeks, we don't want that. The one thing that I would say that I do want, and this is just a personal thing, is instead of the opening ceremonies, which I watch every year and I never ever understand, what I want is the replacement of the opening ceremonies with the closest equivalent from the ancient games, which actually wasn't the opening ceremony. It was probably on the morning of day 3 of the 5-day program. But this was the sacrifice of 100 bulls to the god Zeus. And I think that would be much more impressive and much more meaningful and much more understandable to me and the average viewer than the opening ceremonies we have. Now, I admit there are reasons we don't do this. Most of us don't worship Zeus anymore. We don't have a suitable altar, and it would just add to our infrastructure taxpayer concerns. But I think it would be much more interesting, especially when viewed on TV. You know, even though instead of explaining to us what's going on, you know, the TV commentators would just have to say things like, well, that's the 73rd bull they sacrificed. Jim, I believe number 74 will be next. So that's the one thing. If there's one thing I wish would come back from the ancient Olympics, that would be it.
Okay, Peter, can you top that?
I guess I'm gonna have to follow with politics. I'm sorry. But I will say one thing that I really appreciate about the legacy of the '84 games is that the '84 games did not rip up the city and replace it with a bunch of needless crap, right? Anybody who's been to Montreal or Barcelona knows what I'm talking about, right? You go to these cities and you look on the map and there's this Olympic district and you're like, oh, wow, this is probably gonna be really interesting. And you go and it's a bunch of really like passe, old-fashioned, crumbling infrastructure that there's no reason to visit.
But a mass transit system, too, that move people around in ways that maybe some people would like to see in Los Angeles.
Well, here's what I'll say about '84 in response to that. I think that, you know, I would love to see the metro extended, but the metro is not going to solve all of our problems in Los Angeles. The city is too big. The area is too great. I see in this next Olympics, if we're going to have it, a really good opportunity to start thinking bigger about transportation issues in LA. And by that, I don't mean creating little enclave walking cities. I don't like this idea of gentrifying the core, building up some Gehry or Michael Meltson designed, you know, monstrosity for a bunch of white people to move from the suburbs back into the core after the games. What I would like to see with the 24 games is for people to start thinking seriously about the potential of driverless technology. And if Uber wants to be one of those corporate sponsors, you know, I think this is a big opportunity for them to provide a free service to the games and you know, move people around through with their cars if those cars have drivers or if those cars don't have drivers by that time. We'll see. So as far as the legacy of the games, yeah, I'd like to see a driverless
Okay.
2024 Olympic Games.
The slaughtering of the bulls and the driverless LA.
So
Caitlin.
I would disagree with the opening ceremony. I think we should repeat 1984, which was Lionel Richie singing all night long, and a guy in a jetpack, like hovering around the Coliseum. That seemed pretty great to me. I wasn't born yet, but I watched it on YouTube, and I'd like to see it. And then I guess my other thing is I would hope, and hopefully Zev will do this from the bully pulpit, not in city council this time, but to see the same kind of cost control measure that would protect taxpayers and really explore the option of having a privatized or private funder again, and see if that's something that the IOC can be pushed to think about.
Zev and then Barry.
You know, let me just collect my thoughts here. On the positive side and the legacy side of the Olympics, my favorite part of the Olympics is the opening ceremony. And maybe it's also some of our own or my own mythology, but I think there's something neat about having the Iranian Olympic team and the Israeli Olympic team, because there's only one country separating the two of them, I think it's India, in the same tunnel, getting ready to march out on the field. I think there was something really neat in 1984 when the Eastern Bloc boycotted the games, except for one country, Romania. When the Romanian team marched into the Coliseum, it got the biggest ovation of any other country except for the United States. It was an informed and appreciative country. I told this story on KPCC. I live in the Fairfax area. I live up the street from what used to be Daniel Murphy High School, Catholic parochial high school, staffed largely by nuns. And one Saturday morning, the Olympic torch relay came through our neighborhood on 3rd Street, right by Daniel Murphy High School, as the Orthodox Jews who predominate in the neighborhood were heading for Shul, the synagogue. And I had my camera out there, and I snapped a picture. As the torch was coming by, there was an Orthodox Jew who wasn't supposed to be looking at the action, walking this way, but looking that way at the torch, while 2 nuns were standing there looking at the torch as well. And that was a very symbolic thing to me. And my favorite legacy was it got me back into running. I had been on a hiatus from running for 12 or more years. And when I watched Joan Benoit come down in the 21st mile of the marathon, I said, I want to do what she did. And did run 3 marathons and then retired, as I said, undefeated. Literally defeated. But this is an opportunity, if it's done right. My concern is that, as the LA Times editorial said, that we're getting caught up too much in the boosterism of it and losing sight of reality. Somebody or some bodies has to be speaking for reality. It's very easy for politicians to get carried away with your checkbook. Don't let them do that, because given the opportunity, they will. If it's done right, then this could be another wonderful experience as we had in 1984. It'll be a different experience. It's a different city today. Most of the venues are new, and there will be new experiences. But it's got to be done right. The reason we are all excited about bringing the games back is because of what we remember in 1984, most of us who were around. Those games were not created by somebody parachuting the games down from outer space. They were contentiously negotiated. They were prosecuted in a very fiscally disciplined way until the last athlete walked out of the Coliseum on the last day of the Olympics. That's the way this thing has to be run. I believe that these games can break even, if not generate a surplus, but not if they're going to engage in a huge capital program for which the city may be ultimately responsible. That's my hope. You have to speak up, want the games, but demand responsibility in pursuing them.
Well, of course, as always, I agree with everything Zev says, and I believe his white paper was, in fact, instrumental in a very important city council action that forced the city to take a year that's currently proceeding, the year between now and next fall, to have the opportunity to protect we taxpayers. Where I disagree with Zev, first of all, is his peculiar use of the alphabet. Putting India between Iran and Israel is bizarre.
Oh,
Maybe Iraq.
Maybe
I
it
don't
was
know,
Iraq, and
anyway.
you're right.
But at any rate, the other place where we might have a nuanced difference is that in protecting the taxpayer, we have to understand the circumstances, and looking at history, the circumstances are historically different in one important way. We're not the only bidder. We do have room, and you properly quoted the charter as saying that there's discretion in terms of what kind of guarantee. And in fact, the mayor's budget, blessed be he, contemplates very substantial guarantee covered by private insurance, which is part of that package in terms of potential deficit coverage. So the question is how this ensuing year can be used to both negotiate changes in the wording of the host city agreement, or at least clarify the wording, because as I read the wording now, it's not nearly as bad as you might think, so that we have something we're going to have to sign. The question is exactly what are the words and what are the meanings. If we simply say, take your host agreement, we won't sign it, we might as well stop now, because we're not the only bidder. We do have to understand that we're going to reach for something big. Sure, we protect ourselves, but we'll have to reach for it and do a job. The mayor will be in Lausanne, Switzerland next week or the week after for a long series of meetings with the IOC. I hope and I expect that this situation will be discussed. The IOC has a desire to bring the games back to the United States, if not this time, then sometime soon. We haven't had them since 1996 in the summer. They need us. We have some leverage, but we're going to have to sign something, or you can simply forget it.
Thank you very much. I guess now I'm the one standing between you and the equivalent of the bull slaughtering outside. But I want to thank the panelists for really their wonderful contributions tonight and for helping us think, I think, in a very significant and serious way about the lessons of Olympic past and the ways in which, as I said, we can learn so much from the deeper past, as well as more recent events in terms of thinking about the city's present and future, especially. And I think this program, I hope, really sort of demonstrates what I said at the outset about, as I said, our commitment in the history department to making history matter more to more people. And I think this pilot project that Zev and Caitlin have been involved in has been really wonderful in terms of demonstrating that. And Elisa, thank you, Elisa, sitting back there. And we look forward to moving forward with our Los Angeles initiative, looking at other projects and programs that the city faces and bringing the lens and lessons of history to that. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. I want to invite you all to join us for further conversation out in the foyer, and to keep paying attention to our website and to our announcements. And I look very much forward to seeing you at our next Why History Matters, as well as the other public programs that we do in the history department. And so thank you all very much, and thank you all very much.